Right, here we are on the beautiful island of Coll. Change, where Coll crake in the summer, surf pounds the Atlantic shore in the winter, and we are here on really the eastern shore, which is the one facing the mainland, and it's not quite so subject to the Atlantic gales, so it's a little bit more peaceful. We're a bit more out of the wind, and we can sit and enjoy reading a book about the Declaration of Arbroath. The book I'm talking about was published in 2003 and was republished in 2020 with a new preface. It's about a subject which is basic to all Scottish constitutional debate, which is the Declaration of Arbroath. The Declaration is considered one of the most important political documents in Scottish history, though for reasons I'll explain later, it achieved that status comparatively recently. It was resurrected from obscurity in the early part of the last century by those who claim, as many people still claim, including the author of this book, that Scotland's constitutional history is more inclusive than England's. This kind of radical self-righteousness, which is so much a feature of the constitutional debate in Scotland today, infected many historians of what I would call the Runrig generation. Those who like to take the hills and spend their nights bellying in bothies to the sound of anti-English diatribes which include the received wisdom that in Scotland the people are sovereign, whereas in Britain the Parliament is sovereign. The implication being Scotland is a sort of bottom-up culture with a humane idea at the back of it, whereas the British one is top-down. The people who argue that tend to base their arguments on the Declaration. We're only lucky that a more serious generation of historians followed them. Very few of them now take the Declaration seriously as a constitutional document. It's a very important historical document, but as a constitutional document by which is meant something that gives shape to the overall political arrangement of the country, I think it's pretty well now discredited by serious historians, but it is not discredited in the popular political mind. Now the problem with this is the political class, not ordinary Scottish people, most of whom don't know much about the Declaration, or what little they do know is as a result of what they've heard from the political class and the sheep that follow them. I'm all in favour of sheep, they're all around here, excellent in the oven with little rosemary and garlic in different circumstances, but they don't have independent decision-making abilities, which is what is necessary in a democracy. So the argument about the Declaration of Arbroath really cuts to the heart of what is required for Scotland to be a truly democratic country. Alex Salmond, it will be remembered, proposed in 2005 that the 6th of April, which was the calendar date on which the Declaration was signed, should be a Scottish public holiday called Freedom Day. So this book here, it's subtitled For Freedom Alone. And that's a quote from the Declaration. The author of the book is Edward Cowan, Edward J. Cowan as he likes to be styled, who died recently at a ripe old age, but who had previously been Professor of Scottish History and Literature at Glasgow University. Professor Cowan was widely honoured and was a pioneer of what's called people's history, which was once fashionable in the West among lefty academics with a guilt complex, at least this is the way I see it, the guilt complex that their country was insufficiently Soviet. Now in the post-Soviet world, people's history, of an extremely distorted sort, I might add, but though this book is distorted too, as I shall try to demonstrate shortly, people's history is making a comeback under Mr. Putin. But it is for freedom alone that I'm making this little program in order to show that people's history really isn't the right way to look at this issue of the Declaration of Arbroath. Now I'm going to concentrate on a much more important aspect of people's history, namely the danger to civil peace which is posed by artificially highlighted differences between different sections of the community, in this case the community of Great Britain. That's where the Declaration of Arbroath comes in.
In fact, the original document was intended to reduce the dangers of conflict between Scotland and England by persuading the Pope to prevent the English going for what, in 14th century terms, was a second referendum after the Scottish army under Robert the Bruce had won the first round at Bannockburn in 1314. The Declaration, of course, being written in 1320, 6 years later. Now, to nationalists, the importance of the Declaration of Arbroath is that it is evidence of popular sovereignty in Scotland, as opposed to England, which allegedly had parliamentary sovereignty, although, of course, at that time, England had no parliamentary sovereignty. And this may seem like an arcane distinction, but let me give you one example of its importance. In 2003, when members of the Holyrood Parliament swearing their oaths or affirmations of allegiance to the Queen, and renouncing to the Crown as a governmental concept and therefore to the Constitution, in other words, the fundamental political structure of the country, Nicholas Sturgeon said, "Before making my affirmation, I wish to declare my belief in the sovereignty of the Scottish people." Now, this seemingly innocent form of words is intended to convey the idea that she was one of those who imagined Scotland had a more democratic constitution than England did. This, of course, is nonsense, since as 1707 the underlying assumptions of the Constitution of Great Britain have been identical from Land's End to Muckle Flugger. But what she perhaps intended to say was that the Scottish Constitution before 1707 had been more democratic than the English one. And since both of those are unwritten, this is a happy hunting ground for politicians with an axe to grind or who want to cause trouble in some fundamental way, like arguing about the status of the country's constitution. And it's for that reason that I've devoted some space in my own book, The Justice Factory, to explaining the true facts behind what was originally called the Arbroath Letter, but which nationalists renamed a declaration because they see it as being comparable to the American Declaration of Independence. Since the Scottish electorate, by and large, doesn't know a great deal about either document, the Declaration of Arbroath can easily be used quite wrongly because the Declaration does not actually say what these people say it says. Alex Salmond said at the time he proposed Freedom Day, "We are the inheritors of that vision and that ideal of setting the country free." Now, you can take your view on whether being set free to be ruled by Alex Salmond is a good thing or a bad thing, or whether the same applies to Nicholas Sturgeon, or indeed whoever's going to follow Nicholas Sturgeon, as somebody inevitably one day will. This produces all sorts of strange results. In 2021, the 701st anniversary of the composition of the Declaration, a series of festivals was arranged in and around Arbroath with performances of music, storytelling, song and dance. Total cost for all this was, according to a Scotsman, £232,000. And, that's big money for a country that is struggling to find the cash to finish a couple of homemade ferries in a Port Glasgow shipyard. But, because it's freedom, you will spend whatever it takes. Now, Professor Cowan, in his preface to this new edition, the one I've got here, some commentators seem unwilling to acknowledge the letter's essentiality, paramountcy, and eminence. That's the Declaration of Arbroath, the Arbroath Letter. Its essentiality, paramountcy, and eminence, while appearing quite relaxed about the privacy of England's much inferior and now largely redundant Magna Carta. Now, this form of sneering at everything English is a peculiar vice of nationalists, from Nicholas Sturgeon, Alex Salmond, through to Mr. Putin. England had invaded Scotland in the 1290s due to a dynastic dispute. Scotland was beaten into submission by King Edward I, known when I was at school as the Hammer of the Scots. Then a decade or so afterwards, the Scots had recovered their poise and organisation, and in 1314 they in turn hammered Edward's son, Edward II, after which the English army fled south, according to friends at Murrayfield, to think again. The man responsible for that victory, King Robert Bruce, found himself facing challenges at home from supporters of an English-backed claimant to the throne, as well as an indirect one from abroad in the person of the Pope. His Holiness had no divisions, as Stalin remarked, but he did have the power of heaven and hell over Scots, who he had already excommunicated for refusing to stop fighting the English. After a meeting of the barons to discuss these threats early in 1320, the declaration was issued saying they would continue to resist the English whether under Bruce or some other king. Now, this was a perfectly legitimate effort of international diplomacy, as the Pope was recognised as the arbiter of European interdynastic disputes. The barons justified their claims against Scotland, and this is the imperial bit. This is what's so important, really. They justified their claim by quoting the victories of their Dalriadan, i.e. Irish ancestors. By referring to the King of Scots, the declaration says, "Expulsus primo Britonibus et Pictus omnino delitus." My Latin isn't good enough to really translate that properly any longer, but the National Archives of Scotland translates it as follows. The Britons it first, that's the Kingdom of Scots, the Britons it first drove out, the Picts it utterly destroyed. The argument in the declaration was that Scottish sovereignty was actually justified by the extirpation of the native peoples by the invaders. Sort of early form of clearances, you could say, except the latter clearances didn't kill people. In modern terms, they claimed the right to rule as a reward for successful ethnic cleansing. The barons were asking the Chief Justice of Christendom, i.e. the Pope, to spare them the sort of treatment they boasted of having meted out to those they had displaced or killed. To me, there is something slightly shameful, almost cowardly. I don't think this is a document that you should refer to with great pride. Now, this is a document which Alex Salmond wanted to erect into a founding charter of his own nationalist statelet. Sturgeon's objection to swearing allegiance to the Queen on the grounds of a belief in popular sovereignty was based on the idea that Scotland has always been superior to England in this respect. It's worth remarking that she made that claim in 2003, but not when she first entered Parliament in 1999. What might have persuaded her in the meantime to change her view? I don't know. But it is worth noting that the first edition of this book came out in 2003. So what sort of evidence of popular sovereignty might there have been in 1320? The first point is that the Scots of those days paid no attention at all to the declaration. In fact, that it was ignored for centuries until it was found to be a useful tool in different battles from those which provoked its composition. It was not even printed until 1680, 350 years after it was composed, and then only in Latin, which few of the people Scots could read by then. It was translated into English only after the 1688 revolution, but still largely ignored. It was not used as a political weapon until the early 20th century, 600 years after it was written. So we're being invited to believe that popular sovereignty was in the Scottish soul, but from 1320 through to the 1930s, it just lay dormant. Okay. The sovereignty of the Scottish people as a line of constitutional history in fact emerged with the SNP, which was founded on the 14th of December 1933. Now that was a year of nationalist upsurge throughout Europe. In Germany, a new party had come to power on the basis of the claims of the sovereignty of Das Volk, which is of course the people, while in the Soviet Union, the Stalinist nationalism was replacing Bolshevik internationalism. Heroes like Peter the Great came back into the favour at the expense of Marx and Lenin. As in the New Germany, the Soviet idea was that a single all-powerful leader would represent the people. German nationalism has moved on since then. Scottish and Russian nationalism has not. Like President Putin, the SNP is still fighting battles which have their roots in the 1930s. The barons who signed the Arbroath letter were said to have been representing the people of Scotland when they said that any king who did not defend the country against the English would be replaced. That is what modern nationalists call popular sovereignty. They contrast this with parliamentary sovereignty, which they see as being a uniquely English form of government. Despite democracy, it is said to be hostile to the Narod-based approach
of the Scots since the Middle Ages. Now, this is not the place to go into these sort of arguments in detail, but it seems to me enough to say that few people accept that medieval Scotland was the only government in Europe at the time, actually with the partial exception of Novgorod the Great, in which the people had some meaningful influence over those who ruled the state. Nonetheless, this fairy tale constitutionalism was the basis on which Sturgeon and others refused to honour the British Queen voluntarily. The idea of a distinction between Scottish popular and English parliamentary sovereignty appealed to those people from the 1930s on who wanted a myth they could use to undermine Westminster governance by demonstrating the superiority of Scottish institutions over English ones. The creative misinterpretation of Scottish constitutional history was the work of John McCormick, who had helped found the National Party of Scotland while, like Sturgeon later, he was studying law at Glasgow University. In the 1930s, he claimed democratic superiority over England because Scotland had always been a freer country than its neighbour. This is what he wrote in his political biography, A Flag in the Wind, which was published in 1955. In nearly 2,000 years, no conqueror has ever brought a new and alien ruling class to subjugate the common people, which of course is exactly the opposite of what the barons were saying, because they said they had conquered the people of Scotland and either expelled or exterminated them. The practice of democracy came naturally to the people of Scotland, since in the fundamental sense of family all men were equal in blood and dignity, if not in power and wealth. We're all Jock Thompson's bairns. Scotland had no need for a Magna Carta. The king was not a supreme ruler standing above all law, but was the head of a family, primus inter pares, who had to obey the law like everyone else. That is, of course, the principle behind Magna Carta, which is now outdated under Professor Cowan. Anyway, every sentence of John McCormick's passage I've just quoted is nonsense. Scotland was conquered by invaders from Ireland who established Del Riada. The only law the Declaration asserts is the right of barons to change kings if the reigning ruler does not do as they want. But that was also the limit of law in the Kremlin in Soviet times, as the fate of Khrushchev illustrated in 1964. And that's a very long way from popular sovereignty. I think you would agree. The suggestion that the king was subject to law was ludicrous in a state which had very little law of any sort except between landowners and the king. There was hardly any people's law of the sort that protected the peasants in contemporary, but of course deeply inferior, England. Later, the idea of law controlling the king, which was the core concept in the Magna Carta, was specifically denied by James VI after he became James I of England. He believed that he was descended from the conquerors of the land north of the Tweed, and so had the same right to rule there as heirs of William the Conqueror south of the Tweed in 1066. James argued that he ruled by right of conquest and therefore, like any imperial victor, above all native law. Victory in battle was a sign of God's favour, hence divine right. That theory was the main cause of the civil war in Britain in the 1640s and 50s, and Charles I was beheaded for accepting this view, despite the fact that he was born in Dunfermline. So between the wars of independence, i.e. Bannockburn, 1314, and 1532, when the College of Justice, i.e. the Courts of Session, were founded, there was not much civil law in Scotland, even in practice. The theory of what we now call Scots law had to wait for Viscount Stair in the 1680s. Criminal law was then also patchy, and in any case was largely delegated to the owners of regalities, sheriffdoms, and other heritable jurisdictions, i.e. to the lairds, or in English terms the gentry. They had rights comparable to those of the lords of the manor and manorial, i.e. local courts, of the Norman gentry. The Treaty of Union in 1707 explicitly preserved these heritable jurisdictions as rights of property in Article 20. These jurisdictions were common in the Highlands and Borders and not unknown elsewhere, and were not abolished until 1747 in the wake of Culloden. The Scottish Parliament was a gathering of lairds and nobles with a certain number of burgesses, and it is worth noting, for all the baloney put out about the inherent democracy in Scotland, hardly anybody was allowed to vote in its elections. This was popular sovereignty without popular enfranchisement.
osmosis, process of osmosis, you discern will of the people. That situation lasted until 1832, when the Reform Act changed the voting system of the Scottish Parliament for the first time. The old Scottish Parliament voting system carried on until 1832. And just to give some context, in very broad terms, at the time of the American Revolution, approximately 1 in 6 Americans had the vote. Those were white, adult, male property owners. Approximately 1 in 60 people in England had the vote. They had to be more substantial property owners. And approximately 1 in 600 Scots had the vote. For example, here, in the Isle of Coll, in the constituency of Argyllshire, it had, right the way through this period, until 1832, as a result of the constitution of the Scottish Parliament, it had an electorate of about 50 people. Same with Inverness, next constituency up. Not only that, every single one of the MPs who served for Argyllshire was a Campbell, appointed by the Duke, or selected by the Duke, I should probably say. And the Reform Act itself wasn't even a product of Scottish democratic internal sensibility. It was a product of an aristocratic English approach, in the sense that the person who was Prime Minister at the time who led the government that put it through was Lord Grey, a Northumbrian nabob, you could say. And I emphasise all this because the idea that the ordinary people of Scotland had any meaningful say in the government before Lord Grey stepped in from the inferior jurisdiction that Cowan denigrates and sneers at is just totally absurd. Misusers of the Declaration of Arbroath, like Alexander and Nicholas Sturgeon, base their claim to rule a separate Scotland either on what, if they're ignorant, is a false prospectus, or, alternatively, if they're not ignorant, is a knowing political fraud. This book, I would suggest, is a kind of accessory to that fraud. And I'll only end by saying that the person to read on this subject is a guy called Colin Kidd, excellent historian, who's taught in Glasgow and Belfast and is now the Professor of History at the University of St Andrews. And I especially recommend his book on this general subject, The Union and Unionisms, Political Thought in Scotland, 1500 to 2000. It was published in 2008, and you can go a little bit further if you've discovered the joys of legal history and have access to the juridical review. His most relevant article on the subject is called Sovereignty and the Scottish Constitution before 1707. And Professor Kidd is clear about the view at the time, i.e. not in Holyrood in 2003. He concludes, and I quote, "There was no national consensus on the location of sovereignty in pre-Union Scotland. Sturgeon's claim to believe in the sovereignty of the Scottish people in contradistinction to English practice is dangerous, divisive nonsense. And the best I can do to halt this dangerous trend is to say, as loudly as I can, that Professor Cowan is talking through his bobble hat. And what I'd like to do as a final point about this is talk to my hostess here, Kirsty McFarlane, whose family have been on this croft for generations and who lives just over the rocks here, and who has a very good understanding of the Gaelic view of all these things, which is completely different from the Anglophone view. Remember that Alex Salmond, when he called his party Alaba recently, he didn't know that he was mistranslating the word that was the fundamental concept of his party, the name. So, I will now ask Kirsty to explain in a few words how she sees the difference between these two ideas of political sovereignty and parliamentary sovereignty, but first of all, basically, the issue of sovereignty.
Sheikh, ha me dolchut rish na húrstí an draste. Ha mission am huye garig ha je hokan mun vleone shachkiet jiuk, shia jiuk. Garig ha doen gestuich fer an roesjel, fer een beug toe een naadje, trussig agus a krunjach an kuch spray. Ulevers an alm tok al maal. sé ro bháin le hacinir, agus saon le dúch ar a gael a bhain dáchean te cholle ag an náam seo, agus nu a bheit hiad ar amach na sémas ach seachad, bheit ecesan, ar amach na répoltach a hógal fig na skíre. Mar sin bheit déithnar ag stréiste an na seo an na sórastol. Dúine a bheit san lugan na dúcha agus innive a rí agus na parlament brechtaniche a dhéan. Súil dé a bevisse don na Collich getá, a bhí a Gaelic do chuach na riach en jo Gaelic do cheannas na caiimbalach. Céir hiad bliana na behráide nu de scríomh an líte reinimel an op vroig sa bhlinne 3 keer fichad. Ba muintear challe as séie an dúchgaren a bhachke ó hús ar chaáil meach rúil waarne. Kutsiken na chur an nuie vrúsich agus a chailin ferran a veice an ar a gael. Kan je lust sé a bheith ekesen líte op vroig agus na briare na chaie chur an géú. Curí mi gealcatá go de gas na Collich ó seo meach na bevésale trie na Njelan, een dúchar an úraachge, seach an dunne fatas a bhena rí ar a gáiltoch. Ag an uil náams gan deach a líiste a scríbeh, ha mi fistrach gon bíach na Collich cúteach a cárig an an bíaldaris, roig a chuirigur na lochlanig, as sé gaifsan na hélan an níir a galappe a chaáil, díirech lechad bliana ranne sin. Hí sin an anamanáte in Njelan, gur na cóicrich ot an galle, fat úne bhór, agus haiscud do gat gúin imetach clechcach skil is tseubach. Mar sin chanorin na hapretú, gur sin carit a jaliste, en commas in na dúine a bheit furach dlú op vroig. A fachkel a honnekas san hiadú sa werelde ag tasach na cóirci flingiag, sovereignty, ag cria in ilm seo. Ha tían an rangis mar sovereignté, ach san a salvajan a hánig an daseach mar superanus. Kutsiken, nyo rotiken a ha as cion chai. Ha ciolach salanju cuach as ástrit de gúich, a ha tarsí nyo eisimalach. Ach mar a bheit ían a gíisigain na behráie, ha tjespet an dráste héin. An an lávan an flói, a ha chuach seo na waie, nyo rotiken a bhunne sa bhain don farlamid an na lunain a han. Sa bhléana 3 keer is fichad, va alappe na dúich ime chultarach. A gailtach sa níir, an an arcah is seolting, na hua fo smaig na lochlanach, agus tír mór na halapping har a rodúine a brin Frankis is berle. Súil in gabe a chritsin, gur o slóach na dúcha seo, an mún fagúnach do rinne gan mún án, a gúntachach gur an úntasan, a bheit a chuach as áste seo. Agus gur o bói san bí ag ginnachke rí na halapping.
Well, thank you very much, Kirsty. That makes it very clear, and I rest my case. Well, I think that's all we need to say, isn't it, on this controversial subject?
Oh, God.